So let's go back to the way we got things started this morning. I asked, what have you been thinking about? And I seriously want you to think about that this morning. What have you been thinking about this week? My guess is you've been thinking about your kids, you've been thinking about your health, thinking about Omicron, thinking about January 6th, thinking about your finances, thinking about football. Did you watch that Chiefs game yesterday? That was a good football game. Won't talk about the game that followed. Then there's just the climate outside. I mean, all this cold air that's coming in. Maybe you're thinking this week about vacation. It's getting cold, and you're like, I want to head south rather than stay here. Maybe the new year has brought some changes for work, and you're questioning things like that. Maybe you're thinking about whether or not you're going to go to the farm show. We have a million random thoughts in our heads every day. One of my daily thoughts is, what am I going to eat for lunch? And on a day like today, I can't go to Chick-fil-A because they're closed on Sunday. So I always have to think, well, what's the second best thing to eat? And since it's, messy outside today, maybe I actually have to go and open the refrigerator and eat something there. But, one of the things I do when I'm standing at my desk and I look around my desk, which is oftentimes pretty messy, and, I was looking at these paper clips that were laying there the other day, and I started wondering to myself, who invented the paper clip? Just a random thing, and then I started thinking, well, did the paper clip come before or after the staple? And, and then I was thinking, do you ever remember these little gold things? I remember using these in school all the time, you put some paper and then you pull the sides out like that. And, those are the strange things that just come to your mind from time to time. By the way, the answer to those questions, because I don't want you going to look this up right now, but the first patent for the bent wire paperclip, our traditional paperclip, was awarded in the United States to Samuel B. Fay in 1867. The stapler patent came in 1866 or 1877, depending upon which design of the stapler. And these little brad things, they were actually invented by one of the guys who invented the stapler, believe it or not. Anyway, so where do all these random thoughts come from? More importantly, why is it that some of them linger in our minds, and some of them, they just come and they go just as quickly as they came? And why do some thoughts, start to stir up emotions in our lives? You know how it is? This thought just comes to your mind and you start to feel this emotion. And sometimes that emotion just keeps building and building and building. And suddenly, before too long, we're just sort of irrational with where our emotions have taken us. As a matter of fact, I know that right now, some of you are not even listening to me. Hey, wake up out there, okay? Some of you are not even listening to me simply because I've sent your mind in a million different directions. Some of you, and I know this about some of you, you started looking up who invented the paperclip, okay? I already gave you the answer, so do that later. Now, last week I challenged you to think again. I challenged you to think again about your faith, about the church, about yourself, about others. I encouraged you to think again by loosening your grip on what you've comfortably believed, and to do the hard work of learning and unlearning and relearning. And as I said last week, and you know this to be a fact, it's hard work to think again. It's just hard work. It's easier just to hold tightly to what we already believe, okay? But to think again requires us to ask questions, to listen, to research, and ultimately, Ultimately, it may require us to be willing to change what we've always believed, and if that's the case, it may suddenly put us at odds with other people. Now, just to clarify something, okay, thinking again doesn't mean that you're always going to change what you believe. It may just help you to understand why you believe it, or it may help you to better articulate why you believe what you believe. But as I said last week, the process of transforming our life into the image of Jesus requires us to think again. Because what Jesus invites us to as his disciples is to change our thoughts, which influence our feelings, which in turn determines the actions and the results of our life. I'll give you a case in point. What was it that Jesus taught his disciples? Jesus taught his disciples to love their enemies. Well, that requires us to think again, because most of us are not naturally inclined to love our enemies. So if we're going to love our enemies, it begins with our thoughts. You know, what do we believe about Jesus' words? What do we believe about all people being made in the image of God and therefore worthy of love? How much do we really value the words of Jesus? Do we keep those thoughts in the forefront of our mind? See, those thoughts then become the thermostat that adjusts the temperature of our emotions. Now, I want you to understand, we live in a culture today where we have a very fundamental problem, and that is that we let our emotions override our thinking. And we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but while your emotions are important, they are a terrible compass for how to live your life. Okay? I'm not going to talk about that anymore right now. But back to emotions. Our emotions drive our behavior. And if you're angry behind the wheel, guess what you're going to do? I know this personally. You're going to speed up. You're going to wave to the other drivers. And you know exactly what I mean when I say that you're going to wave to the other drivers. You know, if you had a bad day at school, had a bad day at work, you know, if your emotions are raw when you walk through the door of your home, chances are pretty good that your next behavior is probably going to be something along the lines of kicking the dog or biting the head off the first person who speaks to you. Am I talking to real people out there? So if we are going to change our behavior, we have to go back to our thoughts. And that's what Paul was writing about to early disciples of Jesus. His letter to the Ephesians begins with 3 chapters of theology, literally what we believe about Jesus and our relationship with God. That's what's covered in those first 3 chapters of Paul's letter to the Ephesians. Then the final 3 chapters of that book get into real practical application. Now, I want you to remember something. Paul is writing to people who have just become disciples of Jesus. These are people who have just begun to understand what it means to step out of the culture that knew nothing of Jesus, that knew nothing of any kind of Judeo-Christian background. And if you stop and think about it, it's not much different than our culture today. But these early disciples, they had no frame of reference for how to think or live or act in a way that honored Jesus. And so I want you to understand, that's the context in which Paul writes. And here's what he said from Ephesians chapter 4, verses 17 through 24, and I'm going to read from the New Living Translation. With the Lord's authority, I say this. Live no longer as the Gentiles do, for they are hopelessly confused. Their minds are full of darkness. They wander far from the life God gives because they have closed their minds and hardened their hearts against Him. They have no sense of shame. They live for lustful pleasure and eagerly practice every kind of impurity. But that isn't what you learned about Christ. Since you have heard about Jesus and have learned the truth that comes from him, throw off your old sinful nature and your former way of life, which is corrupted by lust and deception. Instead, let the Spirit renew your what? Your thoughts and attitudes. Verse 24, put on your new nature, created to be like God, truly righteous and holy. Now, what Paul lays out here is the choice between thinking that leads to life, that is a life that takes on the practical example of Jesus, versus the kind of thinking that leads us into practices that are contrary to the example of Jesus. Here in verse 17, the New International Version says that our thinking must not be futile. Our thinking must not be futile or purposeless and useless. And then Paul goes on to say that the mind, far from the life God gives, is closed and hardened, directed toward selfishness. This futile or hopelessly confused thinking will drive us into dark places that aren't life-giving and life-affirming for you or for other people. So what does Paul say? Paul says in this passage that we have to throw off that old way of life, the old way of thinking. And in verses 23 and 24, Paul writes, let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes and put on a new nature. Literally, put on a new way of thinking. And Paul tries to drive this home for people over and over again. In his writing to the church in Rome, he said this in Romans 12:2. He said, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed, and listen, by the renewing of your mind. The Message paraphrase says, don't become so well adjusted to your culture. And the Passion Translation says, stop imitating the ideals and opinions of the culture around you. Paul is adamant that our thinking has to undergo a transformation for us to live like Jesus. Let me say that again. Paul is adamant that our thinking has to undergo a transformation for us to live like Jesus. Now, we're going to talk about this in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, we're going to look at a passage from 2 Corinthians chapter 10 where Paul challenges his hearers to take captive and to make obedient every thought. In other words, we have to start at the point of our thoughts. We have to make our thoughts like those of Jesus. If we're going to change the results of our behavior and be identified as disciples of Jesus, we have to take them captive. We have to make them obedient to Christ. Next week, we're going to look at Philippians chapter 4, and there Paul tells us what we're supposed to think about. He says, think about those things that are true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable. And just think about this for a moment. How different would our culture really be if our thinking is in line with the mind of Christ? Gee, that could be transformative. If we thought like Jesus and less like the world, wow. I mean, just think about it. If the disciples of Jesus had thoughts that sought out the common good, that saw people at their best, as people who are made in the image of God, imagine how different our culture would be. If instead of letting the darkened mind of the culture press us into their opinions, we chose to think again and to think like Jesus, it would be different. And the culture that we live in would be different because we would be influenced by things that bring us life and bring life to other people. Now, at the beginning of the message, I asked what you were thinking about this week. And, we oftentimes imagine that our thoughts are just random. A neuron sparks here, and that causes us to think about the strangest thing at the strangest moment, But if you were around a few months ago, I talked about this thing called the reticular activating system. It's a part of our brain. And that's the part of our brain that regulates which stimuli you pay attention to, which things you ignore. It's sort of like the gatekeeper of our minds. Or another way to think about it is it's sort of that mental radar that puts things on our mind. Well, the reticular activating system determines what you notice and what goes unnoticed. The easiest thing about this, the way to remember this is it's sort of like if you get a new car, you thought to yourself, I've never seen this car on the road before, and all of a sudden, once you're driving that car, you see that car everywhere. You see, what you think about, what you're noticing is determining what you're going to think about. What you're noticing now is going to determine what you're going to think about later. So here's the thinking challenge I want to put before you for this week. Okay, if our reticular activating system is going to make us notice things, well, what would happen if you would begin each day by putting into that system some words of Scripture? And just choose a verse, something that comes to us from the life of Jesus, maybe a proverb, maybe a word of a psalm, something that's simple that you can plant in your reticular activating system. And as you go through the day, it just continually comes back over and over and over again. Because you see, if we begin to do that, we're going to renew our thoughts and attitudes with the words of Scripture, and that's going to, in turn, influence our emotions, which are going to drive our behaviors, which are going to influence the results that we see in our life. And along with that challenge, I just want to encourage you to think about this. What are the voices, what are the images that you shouldn't be putting into your thoughts this week? Because sometimes what we need to do is we need to eliminate those things so that they're not constantly coming back into our head. So maybe we can start transforming our lives, start transforming our homes, our schools, our workplaces by thinking the thoughts of Jesus and imitating his life in ours.